need to have the same level of documentation as the AG. In general, I found that the information that we need has been provided by government departments. And as I said, we don't have the same mandate, so we don't require the same level of proof. But in general, we have not had major issues in getting documents that we need for the purpose of the types of reports that we have been preparing for the benefit of parliamentarians.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from your reports consistently and through your evaluation is, I think, what we've concluded on this side of the table, and that is that the problems that we're seeing in ArriveScan are endemic throughout government. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Scusi. Mr. Baines, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Monsieur Giroux, and your team for joining us again today. My first question to you is, Richmond residents have the longest life expectancy in Canada. And as we look ahead to consider our future economic position, how much will the benefit to the elderly increase in the medium and long term? What is the benefit?
So we have we've seen in the, I think it's either in the mains or in the subs that benefits for seniors will amount to about $81 billion in this year, and they're expected to rise to above $90 billion over the foreseeable future. So by 28-29, they're expected to reach $99.7 billion. So they're expected to increase between 5 and 7% in the next couple of years per year.
Okay, and have the increasing costs as a result of an aging population had an effect on your long-term projections?
Yes. The aging population has obviously an impact on long-term sustainability of all levels of government in the country, including the federal and provincial governments. However, we find that the federal government, because of the nature of its spending, its own spending, is still sustainable. Well, when we last checked in July, when we last released a report, despite the aging of the population, the federal finances were still sustainable due to the very nature of the government spending, mostly transfers to individuals and transfers to other levels of government.
I'm going to switch into national defense. According to your department, 1/5 of the proposed budgetary spending is for national defense, and this includes $591 million for the Canadian multi-mission aircraft project, $510 million for the strategic tanker transport capability project, and $235 million for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization assurance and deterrence measures in Europe. So in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, the Harper government's funding for the CAF fell below 1% of GDP. With the addition of the items just mentioned, what percent of Canada's GDP is allocated to military spending now?
We have not done a recent update since April 2022 of the Government of Canada's spending as a share on military expenditures as a share of GDP. So we're something that we are considering doing, because it's not as straightforward as it may sound, because the NATO definition not only includes spending on national defense, but also spending on veterans issues, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard, among other things. So the calculation of the proportion of spending of GDP that goes to national defense under the NATO definition is not always as straightforward. So I don't have an updated figure, unfortunately.
So we haven't completed that exercise?
The Government of Canada may have, but we have not updated that since the last time we published it in 2022.
Okay. Can you please provide an update on the impact of policy interest rate increases on debt servicing costs? And if you can describe implications for the government's expenditure plan.
Sure. So we estimate that this year spending on debt servicing costs will be about $46 billion. And with the interest rate increases and the time it takes for the impact to be fully felt on the stock of debt as government debt gets refinanced progressively, we expect that amount to increase to $62 billion by 2028-29.
Okay. Mr. Chair, how much time? Yeah, okay. How much do the estimates provide for implementation of the Jordan's principle?
I think I'll have to go back. So Jill tells me, go ahead, Jill.
So in supplementary estimates C, we saw $804 million for the continued implementation of Jordan's principle. So that was for 23-24.
There's some negative values in the supplementary estimates. What do these figures represent, and do you see this often?
Is that for Indigenous services or?
Any of the negative values that have been seen? You can pick whichever one.
I can provide one example. It can often be for transfers between organizations. So if you see a negative amount, it could be from one organization transferring that amount to a different organization. So you'll.
Commonality?
It is, but it's required parliamentary approval, which is why you'll see it come through the estimates in order for them to transfer.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have to.
Thanks very much, Mr. Baines. Mrs. Vignola, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Giroux, Madame Van der Vis, Ms. Griswold, thank you so much for being here this morning. My first question, we received the budget in February, and then we got the main estimates for the following year, 2024-25, but on April the 16th, 2024, that budget will be brought down. So what does that tell us about the main estimates that we are going to have to consider? Well, the main estimates that we are asking you to approve as parliamentarians just gives you a very partial view of what will be needed because in that budget, main estimates that we are asking you to approve, there's no budgetary initiative included. We are asking you to consider its approval or at least debate its approval, but it does not include the measures that will be brought in by the Minister of Finance on April the 16th. It doesn't allow you to have the full picture, an enlightened picture of what the government will be asking for during the year. You're going to get the budget on April 16th as parliamentarians. You'll look at the main estimates and the appropriations, but that budget will be brought in after that document. So really, in a sense, it's a reversal of the order when the government normally would bring in something in February, which would allow Treasury Board to look at measures that could be included in the Appropriation Act that would arise from that budget. So it seems to me that it's backwards what the government is doing right now. Well, yes, it is a reversal of what is normally done in terms of departments, because here we're asking you to approve the major proportion of funds for the government before the departmental usage is specified. Well, given the situation, because interest rates are rising, the budgets are growing as well, and we have rates which aren't even comparable to what we saw during the pandemic. All those support programs that were put in during the pandemic have now ended. So what does that mean for expenditures on the long term in terms of the debt itself? Well, there are several measures that were introduced over the years, Those related to COVID have expired, but in previous documents, it was felt that a good part of the flexibility of the government's ability to function over the years had to do with the things that were not related to COVID. So a good proportion of those $1 billion that were allotted were dealing with other matters. They dealt with the operation of the government, costs rise, and in fact is 50% higher now than it was pre-pandemic. So we also have personnel expenditures, which are significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels, and the public service, which has many more employees, full-time FTEs, full-time employees, many more than over the past years. So personnel costs have certainly increased, even though the pandemic supports have expired and are no longer necessary. I'd briefly now like to turn to an older report in 2022, not that old, I guess, on the carbon tax, and I just want to look at it, and I believe everybody should read the PBO's reports, everybody in the general population, because what you write really sheds light on a multitude of subjects. But at one point, they cost about the net cost of carbon for households and its effect on fiscal economics. Now 2021, 31 rather, where there would be a maximum load in terms of the carbon tax. I think about low-income households where they get some bit more money in terms of the allocation that's given to them, a bit more than they actually spend for the carbon tax. And in fact, it's the rich who are really being penalized in terms of the system of the rebate. Well, when we have a direct payout, say related to heating costs, to gasoline costs, that is energy, as well as the GST. We consider that as a whole, less the rebates that are given to households, where the federal tax applies in some provinces. About 80% of the households get more or less what they pay out. The 20% that don't are higher income households, or they are heavier consumers. They consume more, and that would explain the discrepancy. So more or less households, on average, seem to have a consumption and income balanced.
Mr. Backrack, please, for 6, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, for your presentation. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. It's not directly related to the supplementary estimates, but a few days ago there was some reporting on the proposed cuts to Indigenous services and Crown Indigenous relations, I believe around $417 million over 3 years. I saw that you were quoted in the article, so I thought I'd use this opportunity to ask you about it. These cuts come at a time when Indigenous communities, many Indigenous communities, including those in Northwest BC, are struggling to deliver basic services for their communities in the face of scarce financial resources from the federal government. And we know that Indigenous communities struggle with serious housing issues, with poverty, with transportation challenges, particularly in the north. Now, the ministers have said that these are not going to impact service delivery, and I find that somewhat difficult to believe. I'm wondering if you could unpack for us how cutting $417 million could not impact service delivery when it comes to Indigenous services and Crown Indigenous relations.
So I think it's a bit early to be certain that there won't be any impacts on services. However, based on what Indigenous